Good afternoon, all of you. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Novartis and AIOS. Today we have a wonderful session with regards to the cataract management. As we know, the cataract surgery is one of the most commonly done surgical procedure across world, and the current standard of care, it involves the span of eye drops needs to be done with the permutation and the combination, and which ultimately affects the patient compliance and the ultimate treatment outcome. So with regards to the same, today we have faculty of Dr. Shreyas Ramamurthy, Dr. Tihin Chaudhary, and Dr. Vaishali Vasavda, who will be discussing regards to nuances of the cataract surgery. So first, I would like to welcome Dr. Shreyas Ramamurthy, who is consultant cornea, cataract and refractive services at Eye Foundation, Coimbatore. He has 22 publications in peer-reviewed journal. He has multiple instruction course papers, has been awarded gold medal for outstanding contribution at IISI. He has a special interest in laminar corneal surgery and ocular surface procedures like mucous membrane grafts and stem cell transplantation. Dr. Shreyas Ramamurthy will take us through the therapeutic care after the cataract surgery. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. At the outset, I would like to thank Novartis and AIOS for having me over here. So I'll just start sharing the screen. So I've put together a simple presentation, which is going to talk about the postoperative management, intraoperative and postoperative management in cataract surgery. So as we all know, I mean, the cataract surgery is by far the most commonly performed surgery in ophthalmology. And definitely, as the techniques and the technology involved in cataract surgery keeps on improving, we are looking at ways in which we can make it even more comfortable and better in terms of patient comfort, outcomes, and safety. So the two major aspects that we are looking at is infection and inflammation. I will be talking about essentially antibiotic usage intraoperatively and postoperatively while addressing infection. And with inflammation, I'll just talk a little bit about the steroid usage. I will stay away from NSAIDs. I think Dr. Tuhin sir will be addressing the usage of Ilibro and other things in preventing CME and postoperative inflammation. So quickly about infections. So really, what we are trying to avoid here is a deadly complication of a very straightforward and very repeatable and very reliable cataract surgery, which is to prevent infectious endophthalmitis. And everything we talk about as far as antibiotics is concerned is really down to preventing endophthalmitis. There has obviously been a growing resistance to the older generation fluoroquinolones, which is very well documented. And with that, over the last decade and a half, we've had the advent of the newer generation fluoroquinolones, which is gadifloxacin, moxifloxacin, and becifloxacin, which I still think has not become routine postoperative use or intraoperative use. But Gati and Moxi, we are using widely across all our cataract surgeries. So one of the advantages that moxifloxacin does have is that compared to the older fluoroquinolones, which requires a single mutation, where just on the topoisomerase 4 alone would be sufficient in giving rise to resistance. The fourth generation fluoroquinolones require a two-hit mutation. So it needs a mutation at the topoisomerase 4 as well as the DNA gyrase, and because of which it is a lot safer, and the incidence of resistance to moxifloxacin is extremely rare. Along with that, we are also looking at the MIC levels of the various antibiotics. And the reason I'm just put up this slide, is that while the older generation fluoroquinolones had excellent coverage against gram-negative organisms, gram-positive organisms form a major portion of our postoperative endophthalmitis. And therefore, the older generation fluoroquinolones were not working very well. Moxifloxacin has an excellent coverage against gram-positive organisms as well. And as given in this data, 69% of endophthalmitis have positive cultures, and of which 94% were gram-positive. The picture is a little different in our country, but having said that, it is gram-positive continues to remain the most common even in our country. And Staph aureus, Staph epidermidis, and Streptococcus continue to remain the most common pathogens which cause postoperative infections, postoperative endophthalmitis. And among the fluoroquinolones, the moxifloxacin has the greatest efficacy of all. So the aqueous penetration of moxifloxacin is also extremely good. It also has something called a dose-dependent toxicity. That is, as we increase the dosage, even a slightly resistant organism can be overcome by the usage of moxifloxacin, and that reaches adequate MIC levels in the anterior chamber with a dose-dependent increase in the toxicity. Methods of prophylaxis: preoperative usage, which is very, very debatable. We don't have sufficient evidence to say that the usage of preoperative antibiotics has any role in preventing postoperative infections. Intraoperative, however, I mean, there has been a lot of debate, maybe even 5 or 7 years back, but I think that has been settled down now, and usage of intracameral antibiotics is almost becoming universal. So with intracameral antibiotics itself, we have different candidates. One of the most commonly used one, especially in Europe, is intracameral cefuroxime. Now, cefuroxime is a gram-negative antibiotic, has excellent gram-positive, slight moderate gram-negative coverage, and the usage was really highlighted in this particular ESCRS study, where they looked at the outcomes of using intracameral cefuroxime. So they had 4 groups: one where there was no antibiotics used, just placebo; in group B, where they used only intracameral antibiotic; in group C, where they used only topical antibiotics; in group D, where they used topical antibiotics as well as intracameral injection. So what was important to see here is there was a 5-fold reduction in the endophthalmitis rate when we used the intracameral antibiotic. What was also surprising to see was that the usage of just a topical antibiotic, which is what we were doing until very recently, was no better than placebo. The incidence of endophthalmitis in group A and group C, where the only difference was no topical antibiotic used, here topical antibiotic was used in group C, the incidence of endophthalmitis was not very different. And at the same time, when you added a topical antibiotic to intracameral injection, it did not bring down the incidence of endophthalmitis by much. So at least none of these numbers were statistically significant, except the fact that there was a 5-fold reduction in the incidence of endophthalmitis when we used an intracameral antibiotic. One of the criticisms of the ESCRS study is that the high incidence of endophthalmitis in the control group of almost 0.35%, which we saw in the previous slide as well. Normally, our incidence in most of the good centers across our country is less than 0.1. So 0.35 is significantly higher than that. So that is one of the reasons which could be biasing the outcomes of this study. Reevaluating the usage of intracameral cefuroxime in our Indian setting, this was a study out of LV Prasad. They found that it did not have any difference in the incidence of endophthalmitis when intracameral cefuroxime was used. Sorry. Yeah. But possibly what could be the reasons for this happening? The main reason for this is that in our country, compared to Europe, where the study was conducted, where a vast majority of the endophthalmitis was caused by gram-positive organisms, in our country, 42% of them are caused by gram-negative and an additional 7% fungal. So almost 50% is not covered by the usage of cefuroxime. And that is possibly one reason why it did not show a similar efficacy in an Indian setting as compared to what was in the Europe. Now, more or less, most of us have switched over to the usage of intracameral moxifloxacin, which is a 4th-generation quinolone, as all of you know, and has an excellent spectrum against both gram-positive and gram-negative. Importantly, it is available preservative-free, and it is commercially available in India and is used widely by most surgeons. So one of the best studies to highlight the usage and the efficacy of intracameral moxifloxacin was done out of Aravind Eye Hospital, where they showed that this was the initial study. They have gone on to do it over 6 lakh and then subsequently 2 million patients. But this was the initial study which paved the way for the usage of intracameral moxifloxacin, where they used it in small incision cataract surgery in one arm, another arm where they did not use it in small incision cataract surgery, and then in phaco with a smaller clear corneal incision where it was not used in a private setting. They found there was a statistically significant reduction in the incidence of endophthalmitis when the intracameral moxifloxacin was used. This was extremely good because this was a large study over, over a lack of patients done over a short duration of 14 months. So this kind of removes any possible geographic variations in endophthalmitis which may have, or any cluster infections which could really bias the outcome. It has a fourfold decrease in endophthalmitis, which is statistically significant. Rarely any study has shown statistical significance. And this was despite the fact that larger incisions like was used as in SICS. It was in patients through our CAMP patients, lower socioeconomic patients, and 40% of surgeries were performed by surgeons in training. So despite that, there was statistically significant improvement with the use of moxifloxacin. Importantly, it did not show any adverse effects to moxifloxacin. And interestingly, they also did a cost effectiveness study. The cost required to treat 30 cases of endophthalmitis was identical to the cost of actually treating the patients who went on to develop endophthalmitis in the group which did not have moxifloxacin. So it does justify the cost of using intracameral moxifloxacin in all patients. This was reaffirmed in a study which they extended to 600,000 cases. And what was important was it reduced incidence of endophthalmitis even in complicated cases where PCR was done and where a PCR had happened. And there was it reduced it by almost 50% when it as opposed to the arm where intracameral moxifloxacin was not used. Moxifloxacin versus cefuroxime definitely has a wider spectrum, moxifloxacin. And as I mentioned earlier, it has a dose-dependent toxicity, which makes it even sufficient to kill resistant organisms like resistant Staph aureus. Vancomycin is the third candidate drug, which has been used widely. It has excellent gram-positive coverage, very effective against MRSA, as we all know. Studies, especially good ones done out of Australia, showed 5 to 9 time reduction in the incidence of endophthalmitis. However, HORV has been reported several times over. There are multiple case reports of HORV, and this is a deadly combination, potentially blinding complication. So something we have to ask ourselves when you're using vancomycin is it acceptable to have a rare side effect? Yes, HORV is a rare side effect, but is it acceptable to have a rare side effect for using an agent which is being used to prevent a rare complication in itself? So endophthalmitis itself is not common, and we are using it in every patient. And even to have a rare HORV in a patient who would have probably not even required the drug is probably not acceptable. And that is why vancomycin has not been used widely in our country. So effective perioperative prophylaxis definitely can decrease. Moxifloxacin seems to be the best drug for using intracamerally, and future novel drug mechanisms hopefully will also have a greater role in this. So I'll quickly move on to inflammation. And when we're talking about inflammation, obviously, most of the patient's discomfort is in the initial postoperative period is produced by the inflammation from cataract surgery. Though routine normal cataract surgery itself does not produce much inflammation, but any difficult cataract surgery or post-uveitic cataract surgeries definitely require an adequate dosage of corticosteroids. Both corticosteroids and NSAIDs have a great role in suppressing the inflammation, and I will restrict my discussion to corticosteroids. So the reason for being here, we are here in a Novartis group, and obviously I'm going to discuss about the usage of Vigadexa versus the other candidate steroids. So first thing is we've seen that moxifloxacin is effective. Now talking about dexamethasone. So dexamethasone, in comparison to prednisolone acetate, which is possibly the most widely used topical steroid, it has better anti-inflammatory potency and has a longer duration of action. The only concern is in the longer duration, it can cause a sharp IOP rise. So the other question which we needed to ask, me being a corneal surgeon, I have never been comfortable combining drugs. So I prefer using antibiotics separately and steroids separately. So when this molecule came about and combining a dexamethasone with moxifloxacin, I was initially a little hesitant. And these were a couple of studies which did help me in understanding it. And they showed that they did a comparative study where they used the combination molecule Vigadexa and as well as using moxifloxacin and dexamethasone separately. And they found that whether it was ocular pain or whether it was the inflammatory signs or the cells in the anterior chamber was all equivalent between both the groups. So that is the combination medication Vigadexa worked just as well as giving Vigamox separately, moxifloxacin separately, and dexamethasone separately. So therefore, the combination worked very well. So at that time when Vigadexa was being introduced, we were using loteprednol and datifloxacin as our routine usage. We used loteprednol for 6 weeks and datifloxacin for just 1 week, and NSAID drops were given for a period of 6 weeks. Now, Vigadexa, they came up with the theme that using it just for 2 weeks and 4 times a day for 2 weeks was sufficient. And that was something which was attractive, which would make it easier for the patient. So we did a head-to-head study comparing usage of Vigadexa for 4 times a day for 2 weeks versus the standard loteprednol, which we were using in tapering doses for 6 weeks, along with datifloxacin for the initial 2 weeks. This was just a quick study done over a period of 2 months, and 336 eyes which received moxifloxacin dexamethasone, and 316 eyes which required loteprednol and datifloxacin. The age was similar between both the groups. The grade of cataract, as you would imagine, the harder grades of cataract would probably require more phacopower and possibly more inflammation. And the number of the kind of grade of cataract was evenly distributed between both the groups. What we did study as a result, when we looked at it at 2 weeks as well as at 6 weeks, first at 2 weeks, we found that actually the eyes which had more than 0.5 cells was lower in the Vigadexa group as compared to the loteprednol and datifloxacin group. So there was a faster control of inflammation. At 6 weeks, the residual inflammation was similar across both groups. So essentially, Vigadexa had a faster onset of action, but despite the fact that it was stopped at 2 weeks, at 6 weeks, there was no higher incidence in rebound inflammation as compared to loteprednol. In fact, after stopping loteprednol at 6 weeks, we had more cases of rebound inflammation than we had with the Vigadexa group. The IOP raise was slightly higher in the Vigadexa group. I must say that 2 of these patients were patients who were not clearly told that they have to stop after 2 weeks, and they probably assumed that they had to use it for a little longer. And the 2 out of the 3 patients were ones who ended up using Vigadexa beyond the initial 2 weeks. So out of all the patients who used it just for 2 weeks, we had only 1 patient out of the 334 who used Vigadexa developing a raise in intraocular pressure. So the complications, again, CME incidence was similar in both groups. There was no infection or endophthalmitis in either group to talk about. A limitation, it was a retrospective study. We did not do OCT measurements. We used bromfenac in both groups, maybe using nepafenac or using the newer molecule Ilivro, which is what I'm using today, would have probably have had a slightly different result. But having said that, the purpose was to compare a steroid antibiotic combination with another steroid and antibiotic we were using. So that's why we kept the same NSAID across both the groups, and we did not find any significant difference. And we in fact found that the Vigadexa molecule worked slightly better. So using 4 times for 2 weeks obviously has the great advantage of reducing the number of drops that a patient has to use. And you combine that with Ilivro, which is just once a day dosing for 3 weeks, the number of drops which a patient has to use is extremely less. It definitely improves patient compliance with the treatment, decreases the complexity. They don't have to, these old patients don't have to remember the number of drops, the timing of drops, the number of alarms that they set on their cell phone. All of this can really come down. And there's a higher likelihood that they'll receive the proper dosage. Cost-wise also, because they're just buying 1 vial compared to 2 or 3, which they may require when you're using a 6-week regimen, the cost would also actually come down. And this can positively impact clinical outcomes, as I showed in the study earlier. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Shall we take the question right now, or shall we complete all sessions together?
Sure, Dr. Utkarsh, whichever way you want. Actually, unfortunately, yes. I had informed this earlier. I have another IC at 4 o'clock, so I might have to leave at 4. That's the only problem.
Yeah. No issues. I think so in that case, I think we should take the questions right away. So Dr. Tuhin, with regards to your clinical practice, so as you mentioned that the combination we are not using because of the number of other features which we come into the picture. So what is your clinical experience with regards to the using this combination and having a rebound
Rather, I am asking this question to Shreyas. I have never
in the
used
clinical practice.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
I have never used any sort of
Yes, we can hear
combination drugs so far. So only thing is that in some cases where it is used only for 2 weeks or like that, then only I used it, and then I stopped it and just switched over to only just dexamethasone or like that. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yes.
So in some conditions where this Vigadexa or any sort of combination steroid antibiotic combinations are given, that is should be given only for a short period of time. That is only 2 to 3 weeks, not more than that, because we cannot taper those medications. So just you have to stop that. That's the only, my only feeling is that only. What I would say, are you using this combination?
No, sir. I mean, I was not using any. I generally don't use combination medicines, as you're saying, especially when it comes to regular corneal, whether procedures, corneal infections. So I use steroids separately, antibiotics separately. Okay. But when this molecule came about, that's when we did this study also, and we looked at it. And now I use this routinely in my post-cataract surgery patients, at least, not the corneal procedures, but in cataract surgery, I've switched over to the regimen of Vigadexa 4 times a day for 2 weeks and Ilivro once a day for 3 weeks. And it just has drastically reduced the number of drops that a patient is using, the duration, so patient feels more comfortable. They feel that they are back to normalcy very soon. So, and are willing to get their other eye done a little more quickly as well.
So do you feel that whenever you are thinking that patients are coming, that's like that anterior uveitis, but you don't find any sort of cells and you can't rule out any sort of viral conjunctivitis, in those conditions, do you use Vigadexa or just only antibiotics? In some cases where I feel that I cannot rule out viral conjunctivitis, or there is possibility that there is some sort of reactions. In those conditions, only for 2 weeks, I just use the steroid antibiotics.
Those kind of conditions, my go-to steroid is loteprednol, sir. I don't use dexamethasone in those situations. Only in surgical conditions where I expect the inflammation to be much higher, I use dexamethasone. Otherwise, surface steroid like loteprednol works very well. I don't want to call it a surface steroid because I find loteprednol to be effective even in cataract surgery. But at least I would use a fluoromethalone or loteprednol combination, or loteprednol in those viral conjunctivitis patients.
Okay.
So Dr. Shreyas, if you want to define that, what should be the ideal patient profile for this combination drugs, where we should ideally use this drug?
No, I think any routine cataract surgery, even the harder grades of surgery, grade 4 cataracts also, this regimen seems to be very good. Initially, I was a little hesitant thinking whether harder grades of cataract would require a slightly more prolonged dosing, but not really. And I think most of us nowadays with the modern phaco machines, even in harder grades of cataract, the amount of inflammation induced is not much. Secondly, the only cases where I would probably stay away is like uveitic cataracts or other situations which require a more prolonged course of steroids. But and whenever I think initially when this molecule was launched, a lot of people ended up using it for 6 weeks. And that is when they saw a lot of incidents of IOP rise and other things. And any dexamethasone molecule cannot be used over a long period of time. So this being used for 2 weeks and then stopping it seems to be ideal for cataract surgery. Dr. Vaishali will have her thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think Shreyas, first of all, it was a very comprehensive presentation and it was really nice. And like Dr. Shreyas and Dr. Chaudhary both, I still am very hesitant in using combinations, but like he's saying, the problems of multiple drops and frankly speaking, getting a good standalone steroid with these new price control and all, also, especially for my post-op patients, I'm always a little bit worried if I'm using, so Vigadexa is definitely a good idea for 2 weeks in most cases. In some cases, like Dr. Shreyas said, if I have to give a longer taper, I would then switch over to separate. But Vigadexa does make a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shreyas. So moving on to the next session. So that is basically like, I mean, we all know with the routine procedure, we are having a primary prevention in terms of having steroids or antibiotic or in terms of NSAIDs to prevent the further complication, just to as a primary prevention. But still, I mean, if we see the current scenario, the prevalence of the cystoid macular edema is approximate between 2 to 3% across India. So, I mean, although we are having a primary prevention, but still the prevalence of cystoid macular edema is on the higher side. So to discuss with regards to the cystoid macular edema, the topic is unmet need, challenges, and recent development and treatment of CME. We have Min Chaudhary. He has done his MS ophthalmology from Guru Nanak Dev Amritsar. He has done his training.
PowerPoint, sir?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, now is the screen visible now?
Your PowerPoint not visible, sir. This window is visible. I should open PowerPoint, then share, sir.
It is showing that your screen is sharing is paused now. Resume share. Okay. Just a moment. Is it visible now?
No, sir. Share screen, sir. Not share. First one, open PowerPoint, sir. Then share, sir, screen.
Okay, okay. Is it now visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. At the outset, my sincere thanks to Novartis for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. So next few minutes, I'll be talking on unmet needs, challenges, and recent developments in the treatment of CME, that is cystoid macular edema. It's not moving.
Click, sir.
Okay. So if we look at the evolution of cataract surgery, it started in 1920, and then there is some sort of development of phacoemulsification, then envelope technique, and now laser frame cataract surgery. So cataract surgery is one of the most common procedures performed worldwide. It is also one of the oldest surgeries. It's not moving. When it is not moving now, then again. Okay. So if we look at this treatment landscape cataracts, that is the population of India is around 138 crores. And this population above 50 years is 26 crores. And prevalence of cataracts above 50 years is around 12.5 crores. And the cataract surgery which is performed every year is less than 1 crore, that is around 82 lakhs. So that now you can feel that this how much backlog is increasing every year. And now because of pandemic, this backlog is getting increased tremendously. So ocular symptoms after cataract surgery, just like that, just after surgery, you can see that around 60 to 95% patients are having pain. In first post-operative day, the pain is around 3 to 52% cases. And this pain incidence is in 2 to 26% of the cases in first post-operative week. And if you look at the incidence of cystoid macular edema, the overall incidence in Indian patients are that clinical CME is around 12% in uncomplicated cataract cases. And angiographic CME is found in 20% of the cases. Patients with diabetes without any pre-existing diabetic retinopathy, the incidence is around 47%. And if there is pre-existing diabetic retinopathy, the incidence increases to 55%. So now we are looking at the pathophysiology. Pathophysiology is just disruption of the normal blood-retinal barrier due to various factors, and that leads to leakage from the perifoveal retinal capillaries, accumulation of the fluid with intercellular spaces of the retina. There is development of CME, and all this leads to inflammation due to surgical malnutrition is the major cause of CME. So surgical irritation causes irritation in the uvea, lens, or epithelial cells, all those things. All those things lead to increase of the prostaglandins in the aqueous humor, which can be controlled by NSAIDs. In patients who are having, that means systemic vasculopathy, or even old age patients because of inflammation or glaucoma, there is a breakdown of the blood aqueous barrier. All these things lead to this leakage of prostaglandins, cytokines, and inflammatory mediators, both in aqueous humor as well as in vitreous humor. All these lead to breakdown of the blood retinal barrier that leads to development of the CME. So CME is an important postoperative complication of cataract surgery that compromises the result of cataract surgery and can occur even after uneventful cataract surgery, but the incidence rapidly increases after completed cataract surgery. And CME is primary cause of reduced vision following both cataract and vitreoretinal surgery. Even it can be found even after corneal surgery like DSEK or DMEK also. It can be classified as angiographic and clinical CME. Angiographic CME means that it can be defined only by the presence of fluorescent leakage and detected only by fluorescent angiogram. And clinical CME we can detect by slit lamp microscopy using 90 diopter lenses or by indirect ophthalmoscopy. And it presents with decreased visions, and sometimes patients come very late. Only in that cases we can diagnose it. Otherwise you can miss it also. Angiographic CME is more common than clinical CME. And it can be angiographic CME is classified in 4 levels. Level 1 is that edema is less than 360 degree perifoveal area. If there is minimal leakage and minimal edema in the 360 degree perifoveal area, it is called level 2. If there is moderate edema in the perifoveal area, it is called level 3. And if there is severe perifoveal edema, it is called level 4. And angiographic CME is mostly asymptomatic because that we usually get it in level 1 and level 2. It can be classified as per the onset of acute CME, that is within 4 months of surgery. If it is happening after 4 months, then it is called late onset. Chronic CME means that it is lasting more than 6 months, and recurrent CME means that if it appeared and then became all right and then again it appeared, then it is called recurrent CME. So symptoms like that: decrease in visual acuity associated with retinal edema, loss of contrast sensitivity and color vision, metamorphosia, that is this type of distorted vision in which a grid of straight lines appear wavy and parts of the grid may appear blank. Clinically significant, that means foveal edema and retinal thickening more than 300 micrometers seen as a loss of foveal reflex, or that can be detected in slit lamp by direct or indirect ophthalmoscopy. Subclinical foveal edema, that is described as edema less than 300 micrometer, that can be diagnosed only by retinal imaging. Sometimes we can find this vitritis and optic nerve head swelling, that is by clinical examination we can find all these things. Signs and symptoms of clinically significant CME develop within 4 to 12 weeks after surgery and peak approximately 4 to 6 weeks after surgery. The risk factors like the systemic disease, pre-existing ocular comorbid conditions, and intraoperative complications. So we have to identify the risk factors for CME that is crucial for prevention and adequate treatment. So two systemic factors like diabetes mellitus that promotes the development of CME even in the absence of diabetic retinopathy, and two large database studies reported an increased rate of CME incidence after cataract extractions, that is between 1.73 and 3.05%, and the relative risk is around 1.80. Systemic hypertension is also increases the incidence of CME. Furthermore, it is the risk factor for retinal vein occlusion, which itself promotes the development of CME. Ocular comorbid conditions like retinal vein occlusion, glaucoma, vitreoretinal interface changes, vitreomacular tractions, epiretinal membrane can lead to CME, even uveitis also. So intraoperative complications like PC rupture, loss of vitreous, incarcerated vitreous in the wound, cortical remnants in the vitreous, trauma to the iris by either by Malvin ring or by CTR, or even by the tip of the phaco machines, phaco probe. So intraocular lens dislocations, premature ear capsulotomy, iris fixation, or anterior chamber lenses can lead to this development of CME. So diabetes is one of the most important risk factors for the development of CME, and India is the hub of this diabetes. So diabetes and CME in patients with diabetes post-cataract surgery, there is increased risk of post-surgical complications associated with poor visual outcomes. So it is important to monitor all those macular changes. Macular changes are more likely to occur after cataract surgery in patients with diabetes, especially in those who have pre-existing retinopathies compared with those without diabetes. So an increasing risk factor for development of postoperative CME in diabetes. And you should know that histological changes in retina, like addition of the leukocytes to the capillaries, loss of pericytes, and accumulation of the advanced glycation end products, that is AGE, which leads to activity of inflammatory mediators and death of the endothelial cells. That leads to facilitation of the impairment of the blood-retinal barrier, which leads to accumulation of the fluid and serum in the intracellular spaces, and that leads to development of postoperative CME. If you look at this graph, that the incidence of CME, patients with diabetes mellitus, the incidence is 51%, and those without diabetes mellitus, it is 21%. So 2.4 times increased incidence of CME in Indian patients with diabetes. So diagnosis of CME, we have to diagnose it clinically also when it is quite obvious. Otherwise, we should take the help of this different gadgets, color fundus photography, fluorescent angiography, optical coherence tomography, that is OCT, functional testing like the electrophysiology, autofluorescence, and retinal thickness analyzer. So color fundus photography, intraretinal cysts seen in a honeycomb pattern within the foveal region of the macula in the Henle's layer. You can see this honeycomb pattern very minutely. You can see it. Early phase of fluorescent angiography, there is capillary dilatation in the perifoveal region, which can be appreciated here in these cases. And late phase may take 5 to 15 minutes of fluorescent angiography. Leakage into the cystoid spaces is distributed like a honeycomb pattern. So you can get that honeycomb appearance in the late phase itself. In OCT, it can be used to quantify the macular thickening. This is the normal foveal contour. And this is the patient who had these cystic spaces in the outer retinal layer. And this is the patient who had diffuse macular edema. So autofluorescence, light scatters from the structures in the eye without the use of fluorescent dye. Fundus autofluorescence arises from the lipofuscin in the retinal pigment epithelium. And this hyperautofluorescence in CME occurs as the result of this displacement of these macular pigments into the cystoid spaces. So that blue light with a wavelength of 488 nanomicron is used for this fundus autofluorescence imaging using hydral retinal work in angiography or modified fundus camera, we can see all those autofluorescence things only. Now, this management of CME, we have to manage it. That is this prophylactically. That is the most important step. We have to prevent that by traumatic surgery. We can go for plasma vitrectomy if there is vitreous loss. If we can go for medical therapy like NSAIDs, corticosteroids, carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, and anti-VEGF injections. So prophylaxis to prevent. Topical steroids and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are the first-line agent for prevention of postoperative CME. Prophylaxis must be considered especially for patients with risk factors including diabetes, uveitis, venous retinal occlusion, and intraoperative complications such as postoperative, such as posterior capsular rupture and vitreous loss. Patients with cardiovascular diseases, extracapsular cataract extractions, or cases where phacocan was not successful, and patients who are taking anti-glaucoma medications, in those cases, they can get this postoperative CME. So prophylactic treatment is useful and important approach to prevent CME in these patients. Nepafenac for prophylaxis now. So role of Nepafenac in prophylactic management of postoperative CME. And it shows that it can be better, there is better ocular penetration than systemic administration of the Nepafenac, and highly effective than indomethacin, achieves higher aqueous level and tolerably safe profile. So Nepafenac, it rapidly permeates and penetrates into the cornea and sclera and is converted to Amphenac, that is NSAID. Both Nepafenac and Amphenac inhibit the prostaglandin H synthase, that is cyclooxygenase, an enzyme required for the prostaglandin production. And that blocks the inflammation, and that mediated this breakdown of the blood retinal barrier that contributes to the plasma extravasation and edema. And that way it reduces the postoperative CME development. So dosage and administration of this Nepafenac, that is for the reduction of in the risk of postoperative CME associated with cataract surgery in diabetic patients, 1 drop of Ilebro in the conjunctival sac of the affected eyes once a day, just 1 day prior surgery, continues to 60 days after surgery, as directed by the physicians, should be continued for at least 60 days. An addition of the drops should be given on the day of surgery, just 30 minutes to 120 minutes just before surgery. And for the prevention and treatment of pain and inflammation, 1 drop of Ilebro in the conjunctival sac of the affected eye once daily, beginning 1 day prior surgery and continued just for the first 2 weeks of the postoperative period. So for postoperative CME, it is for 2 months, and for postoperative pain, it is for 2 weeks only. Treatment can be extended into the first 3 weeks of if the patients have this postoperative pain. And additional drops should be administered 30 to 120 minutes prior to surgery in all the cases. So clinical evidence, all these that different studies, multi-center studies showed that 0.3% Nepafenac is no way inferior to 0.1% Nepafenac 3 times a day. So prophylactically, it should be begun 1 day before surgery and continue till 60 days post-surgery in high-risk patients such as diabetes, and it reduces the risk of postoperative macular edema, improves best-corrected visual acuity, and no anticipated safety concerns. Current practical challenges in India is that awareness and diagnosis. Make all the ophthalmologists aware of the possibility of CME development, especially in large incision cataract surgery, patients who are having diabetes. And SICS I'm meaning here, and diabetic patients post-traumatic surgery like that, who are surgery done by residents or trainees or fellows, and patients who are having glaucoma or uveitis or retinal pathologies. So all those cases, you should be feeling that the patients may develop CME, and so we should be very careful to address those issues. So you have to improve the diagnosis. What your mind does not know, the eye cannot see. That is this. If this clinically picked up when it is significantly present. In milder diseases may be missed, so we should go for fluorescent angiography, even though it is invasive procedure, but should be done if it is accessible. But at least we can go for OCT. That is this. It is a non-invasive technique and may be available in most of the centers. Though it is this availability in small centers is a questionable issue. So primary use for CME in post-cataract surgery. we can use it. Use in other ocular surgeries, because all those cases we feel that we cannot use this, that we cannot diagnose because of there is lack of FFA, lack of OCT. So off label we can use this Nepafenac without the diagnosis of CME. So in that cases we can use it even for 2 months also. Used in other ocular surgeries that can cause CME, like that post-glaucoma surgeries, post-corneal transplant surgery, as I mentioned, DCEC or DMEC or PK, post-RD surgeries, post-keratoprosthesis CME, we can use this Ilebro. And use in ocular inflammation, episcleritis or scleritis, used to reduce the pain in status post, that means pan-retinal photocoagulations. So all those cases we can use it, even though unapproved, that is off-label use, we can use Nepafenac. So even though there is a lack of specific molecular data, it is quite helpful, like that efficacy of 0.3 versus 0.1 versus Nepafenac 3 day versus 1 day. Pain score or ocular inflammation in other conditions not studied, but ideal duration should be at least 2 months, but though it is not yet standardized. Show unmet need, that is the compliance or adherence. Reduce the number and dosage of the topicals post-cataract surgery. So reduce means that earlier days we used to go for Nepafenac 3 times, now it is Ilebro 1 time only. Combination with steroids, that is faster stepper and the step-taper of steroids, as mentioned by Dr. Shreyas, that we can use this Vigadexa, that combinations for 2 weeks, and then faster we can taper it, and then we can go for Ilebro for at least 2 months. Dropless cataract surgery, intravitreal sustained release NSAIDs can also be a better idea. So thank you for your time. Now, do we have any questions now? I will have to answer that.
Thank you, Dr. Tuhin. I mean, very comprehensive presentation with regards to the assisted macular edema. There is one question with regards to that of innovation timeline, which you have shared in the second slide. I mean, we know that, I mean, there is a significant advance with regards to the cataract, what we can say, technology which we use for the cataract surgery. So over the period of time, it's like a very least invasive surgery if we consider for the cataract. So is there a definite need with regards to the usage of NSAIDs, I mean, in the diabetic patient as a primary prevention? Because, I mean, it can increase the significant treatment burden to the patient.
Yes. So what happens that even though off-label we can use it, even I am also using nowadays, in my all post-operative cataract patients, even my patients who are having this DCEC also or post-PK, I use this Ilebro once daily. And there is no, what we are feeling that NSAIDs may have sort of surface toxicity. I have not encountered any sort of surface toxicity in those patients. And we are thinking that these patients, they may develop CME, all those things, especially nowadays, out of our 60% of the patients, cataract surgery patients are having diabetes. So I am using it all my patients now.
Dr. Vaishali, your views?
So, I do agree with Dr. Tuhin that nobody really knows whether you should use it. For me and for all our clinics at Raghudipai Hospital, we don't use it as a routine just because the patient is diabetic in a regular cataract surgery. But yes, if the patient is a very labile diabetic, already has a retinopathy, other has CME, or the surgery was eventful in any manner, then they will get Nepafenac eye drops for 6 weeks. And now we are switching to Ilebro. My only practical thing with Ilebro is the consistency of the drop, which sometimes makes it a little difficult to use for the patient. But Ilebro has a great advantage in its dosing. But yeah, I would not use it routinely as a prophylaxis in every patient, again, mainly with the aim of reducing the drop burden. So any high risk, yes, of course, for 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay. So what is your clinical experience with regards to the efficacy of 0.1% versus 0.3%? Per se,
Ilebro, I mean, the 0.3% once daily dosing seems to work equally well. And the advantages are two. One, you are putting only one drop, and the suspension is also a little different. So we don't see any surface problems with that as well. So like Dr. Tuhin said, I don't think that is an issue also with this newer drug. So I think it's a great advantage for the patient and for the clinician.
I mean, that's a significant one because we can consider, I mean, the patient who is suffering from cataract, I mean, because of the diabetes, there is a chances of having glaucoma or some other ophthalmic condition. Number of eye drops might be there within the patient's, I mean, time span. So there might be a miss, or I mean, patient might not take at a particular time. So there is a higher chances of flaring of inflammation, other thing. So I mean, that compliance issue can be definitely solved with the higher concentration.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
so
think
safety.
both safety and efficacy, it works very well. And it has a huge advantage amongst all other NSAIDs because of its dosing.
Okay. Okay. So, so Dr. Tuhin, what is your perception with regards to the Nepafenac versus Bromfenac?
Bromfenac, I have never used that. Amphenac, I have used this. Nepafenac and Ilebro, this Nevanac and Ilebro, I have used it. Megabrom or Bromfenac, I have never used it.
Dr. Vaishali?
So yeah, same. I have not very sparingly I've used Bromfenac, but I have always liked Nepafenac and I've never found a reason to switch or change, because Nepafenac has an excellent efficacy in all kinds of, not only post-ops, for any kind of NSAID indication. My go-to drug is Nepafenac.
Okay. So I mean, there is a significant unmet need which lies with regards to the management of the CME, considering like, I mean, we are the diabetic capital of the world, and the significant diabetic population having a cataract along with that. So in that case, I mean, that can be a boon to the patient with regards to the having efficacy and the safety which is at par.
Absolutely.
So I cannot see any other further questions with regards to the session. So we should move to the third session. With Dr. Vaishali Vasavada. So the biggest unmet need across is basically acting as a consultant ophthalmologist at Raghudev Eye Hospital, Jaipur, as well as Ahmedabad. Her area of expertise is in the management of complex cases of adult and the pediatric cataracts. She specializes in modern cataract management, including advanced technology of IOL option and the latest in surgical techniques. She has a special interest in basic and clinical research related to cataracts. She has more than 20 peer-reviewed publications in national as well as international journal. She has more than 5 book chapters to her credit. She is also the reviewer for peer-reviewed journals such as Cataract and Refractive Surgery and Eye Journal. Over to you, Dr. Vaishali.
Thank you so much, Dr. Utkarsh. And let me switch on to my topic. Now, I do admit at the beginning that it sounds a little boring, but rest assured, we will make it very practical and user-friendly. So the idea is that we are talking a lot about so many antibiotics. We started off using ofloxacin and gatifloxacin, tobramycin. Now we have becifloxacin and moxifloxacin and levofloxacin, and everything is so easily accessible, not generic, branded, whatever you say. So there is a lot of use, whether some of it overuse and misuse of antibiotics. So we need to sort of step back and understand what is it that we are doing and the effect of antibiotic resistance. Now, ophthalmology, we all know that topical, intracameral, intravitreal, as well as systemic antibiotics are used depending on the indication. So therefore, we need to be very, very careful now in injudiciously using antibiotics. We know from our physician colleagues that even the highest of antibiotics have started becoming resistant, particularly in hospital settings, and therefore we need to be both careful and yet do the best for our patients. The prime indication for antibiotic use today is infections, particularly corneal infections. And unfortunately, all parts of India, we are blessed with these all bacterial, fungal, viral, all kinds of corneal infections. But we do need to understand where antibiotics stand and what is their role. The primary reason why we like to use is these kind of bacterial ulcers, abscesses, endophthalmitis, which are very prevalent even without any trauma or surgery sometimes in our conditions. And these can be potentially blinding. So yes, these are the prime indication for using an antibiotic, for using a heavy a higher generation antibiotic, and using it very judiciously, sometimes for long periods of time. what is important for us to understand as clinicians is that in all these kind of blepharitis, conjunctivitis, keratitis, endophthalmitis, most common organisms involved are the Staphylococcus aureus, and which we all know is becoming resistant to many drugs, including the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, Staphylococci, coagulase negative, pneumococci, and Pseudomonas. Not that others are not involved, but these are the classical organisms nationally and internationally, and they continue to remain so. Now, Indian data in the past, it was being said that most of our post-surgical or post-trauma infections are always gram negative, unlike the Western world where Staphylococcus still remains a predominant organism. But there have been recent studies, including one from a very prestigious institute in India, which have shown that even today, gram-positive organisms, mainly the Staphylococci of all varieties, are still the majority. Pseudomonas and fungal infections are common, but they are less than 40% of the total infection load, particularly endophthalmitis. So we need an antibiotic even today that is an excellent efficacy on gram-positive as well as a good coverage for gram-negative. That, I think, is something we need to understand. Now, this may remind us of our MBBS days, but just to sort of recap, each antibiotic acts differently. There are bacteriostatic antibiotics and there are bactericidal antibiotics. And bactericidal are obviously preferred. And like Dr. Shreyas had referred to in his first talk, mechanisms that inhibit DNA gyrase as well as topoisomerase or a combination would be better, because getting resistant organisms to these is more difficult. And when we choose an antibiotic, it's not just which is the brand or who is giving us a good deal. What we do need to understand is scientifically which one has the minimum inhibitory concentration which is favorable to us, and yet it has a good killing effect on the organism. And in this table, if you can see, it may look very crowded, but what I do want to show is that all the fluoroquinolones, the modern fourth generation fluoroquinolones, Levo, Gatti, moxifloxacin, they have very low minimum inhibitory concentration. That means a very small amount of the drug is required to kill 90% of the organisms in that tissue, which is much higher with ciprofloxacin and ofloxacin. As you can see, a 0.75 versus only 0.09 for moxifloxacin. And this remains for majority of the common organisms, Staphylococci, pneumococci, gram-negative organisms. Also, what is very important that the moxifloxacin, for example, if you see, susceptibility is almost 100% across the spectrum of organisms and with such a low MIC or minimum inhibitory concentration. So using these makes sense for us, but only when needed. We all understand now, I think nobody is using ofloxacin and ciprofloxacin as a routine, except for the problem with our country also is that pharmacies and chemists over the counter, anybody goes with a red eye or an itchy eye and they will get a ciprofloxacin bottle just for nothing. So we don't need to understand and educate our patients also. When they come with a bottle of a ciprofloxacin eye drop, you need to tell them that not only that you should stop using it, explain to them why it was not the right drug for them and why they should avoid doing these kind of over-the-counter practices. But basically what this slide again shows is that moxifloxacin among all the newer fluoroquinolones has a very, very high potency and is, even more in many organisms than gatifloxacin and levofloxacin. So Staph aureus, which are resistant to methicillin, coagulase negative Staphylococci, gram-negative organisms also, moxifloxacin, levofloxacin, gatifloxacin are very effective. So moxifloxacin for me has become my choice of antibiotic, particularly for all my post-ops, be it corneal surgery or cataract surgery or even pediatric cataract surgery, because preservative-free moxifloxacin, Vigamox, has also been approved for use in infants. So for me, this is a go-to antibiotic for all my post-operative patients. Again, mark my words, only post-operative patients. Like we need to discuss, we need a broad spectrum antibiotic because everything is not going to be a gram-positive. With the newer fluoroquinolones, let's look across ciprofloxacin to Levo, Besi, Gatti, and moxifloxacin. Moxi has a huge coverage of both gram-positive and gram-negative. Now, Besi and gatifloxacin both do not have a good gram-negative coverage. Levofloxacin, yes, it does have some coverage. But overall broad spectrum effect is, even when you look at positive and negative combined together, moxifloxacin scores over newer fluoroquinolones. And if we again look, these are all different kinds of studies. This is more technical, but the gist of this is that when you look at the in vitro susceptibility of conjunctivitis also, because not every conjunctivitis is viral or allergic. For bacterial conjunctivitis, again, moxifloxacin and gatifloxacin, both are excellent. So I'm not trying to say that moxifloxacin is the only potent and effective drug. Yes, gatifloxacin works wonderfully for conjunctivitis. But if I'm looking for a one-stop solution, conjunctivitis, keratitis, endophthalmitis, post-operative prophylaxis, for me, a preservative-free moxifloxacin fits the bill in every aspect. Now, if you see here in this slide, again, these figures, we don't need to go into the technicalities. The gist is that both Besi and moxifloxacin had identical minimum inhibitory concentrations for killing 90% of the organisms, whereas for ciprofloxacin, it was much higher. So point is, aminoglycoside, ciprofloxacin, ofloxacin, all these need to be phased out, particularly for over-the-counter use, and this can only come through educating patients. So what we can do is only educating patients, because the other things are not in our hands as practitioners. Yes, the industry should be driving a lot of awareness for over-the-counter antibiotics, particularly I find it very common, any aminoglycoside like tobramycin or ciprofloxacin is just handed over like peanuts to patients. And these are promoting resistance and obviously not helping the patient's disease. When you choose an antibiotic, how does it penetrate? Looking at this graph here, moxifloxacin, which is the one in the gray, the largest bar, has the highest corneal concentration. So like I said, it is excellent even for keratitis. So even for stromal abscesses, obviously for ulcers, I would start with moxifloxacin as a broad spectrum antibiotic. Then obviously based on isolates and cultures, you might have to change the treatment. Now, when you look at penetration in the conjunctiva, again here if you see this bar, which is moxifloxacin, it is much higher than all other fluoroquinolones. Even in the aqueous humor, moxifloxacin has excellent penetration. The next would be gatifloxacin, but it is less, and we do not have any commercially available preparation that will allow us to do an intracameral injection in either a routine prophylaxis of endophthalmitis. For me and for all surgeons at our centers, it is a practice for many years, for more than 10 years now, we have been using 0.1 ml of intracameral preservative-free Vigamox eye drops, a separate bottle for each patient, just load it in a tuberculin syringe and inject 0.1 ml. One bottle for one patient is our mantra. We do not fill up 4 syringes and put them in a drum and then we use. That is something I think kills the purpose of doing an intracameral antibiotic by adding that much more value of contamination. Now, antibiotic resistance, why should we be discussing it? And Dr. Shreyas also beautifully brought this out because of 2 things. One, organisms are mutating, and COVID has shown us the classical example. So organisms are mutating and becoming resistant to even the highest of highest antibiotics. Also, the injudicious use of antibiotics in our country at least is becoming a problem amongst GPs, amongst physicians. They will just give antibiotic chemists, as we discussed further. So we need to understand that a lot of organisms are now resistant to multiple drugs, including newer generation fluoroquinolones. But ofloxacin, tobramycin, and chloramphenicol, these 3 were found to be extremely resistant to most organisms. So I think in a routine practice, these should be used only very selectively or when the cultures show a sensitivity to these organisms. And even the methicillin resistant Staph aureus, which is probably the most notorious and the most concerning organism for us as cataract surgeons, as refractive surgeons, as practicing OPD clinicians, we are seeing that for 46% resistance of MRSA, even against moxifloxacin, much more, 60 and 70, almost 70% resistance to gatifloxacin and levofloxacin. So it's not like moxifloxacin is a wonder drug and it can never become resistant. But again, like Dr. Shreyas highlighted, the newer fluoroquinolones, there will have to be 2 mutations in the topoisomerase and the DNA gyrase for it to be, for an organism to be resistant. So this is much less likely to be resistant compared to other fluoroquinolones, the older ones, as well as other groups of drugs. Now, like we discussed, that moxifloxacin and maybe levofloxacin also to some extent, resistance is much less today, which does not mean they will not become resistant. And Gatti and Moxi appear to be the best choice for a broad spectrum coverage, which we all do in our practice and we understand that. Also, when I choose an antibiotic, we were discussing the concept of combinations, steroid antibiotic combinations. I feel that when you give a, suppose you give a dexamethasone Vigamox combination and you give it 3 times a day for 2 weeks, the advantage is that because a patient will be using only 1 bottle and they will probably use it 3 times, the incidence of resistance will also reduce because you are controlling the duration and you are at least trying to improve the compliance frequency. Now, if I were to give a moxifloxacin 3 times a day, or steroid 4 times a day, and an NSAID and a lubricant and probably a cycloplegic, maybe the patient will drop the frequency of these drops from 3 times a day. They might use it only once or twice. Inadequate dosage also is a very important factor in promoting antibiotic resistance. And we know that there are several mechanisms which could be at the level of the organism and at the level of the drug. So genetic, like mutational resistance is very common, but also modification of the antibiotic molecule, decreased penetration, change in the organism target site. These are common mechanisms. And I'm very strong in my opinion that proper dosage and proper frequency is very important, because if you either use it for too less or too much and for a too long time, that is something that is going to promote resistance at a community level. Now, when you use any drug, let's say you have moxifloxacin 5 brands to choose from, how do you choose? When we talk of antibiotic resistance, the pH, the amount of the active drug, how soluble it is, how much is actually penetrating, and how stable the solution is, all these will play a very important role. It's not just the drug. So all the paraphernalia, which have to be very tightly controlled in terms of their quality, will also affect antibiotic resistance. And obviously the prime factor is misuse, not only in humans, but also in animals, because now we see so much of dairy, poultry, cultivation, all forms of animal and farming and husbandry, which is also contributing to systemic antibiotic resistance. No need to say that red eye and antibiotic of higher. We don't even start with a lower antibiotic. We straight away give moxifloxacin, gatifloxacin, levofloxacin. And particularly in this COVID time, the last 16, 18 months, with a lot of teleconsults happening, nobody wants to risk it, obviously. So there has been a lot of overuse of WhatsApp or teleconsults, and obviously over-the-counter higher antibiotics, which is something which we should strongly be looking at and avoiding. Appropriate drug in every way, and therefore, in my opinion, branded versus generic. Now, I'll just take a few seconds to talk about branded and generic. In the Western world, generic and branded are very distinctly defined, but in India, generic is again subdivided into branded generic and true generic, and we really don't have too many true generic drugs. It is either the innovator brand or it is a branded generic, which means that it is using the same formulation or the same constitution as the patented drug once the patent wears off, and then it is being produced by brands. So there is a difference between true generic and branded generic and the innovator drug. Innovator drug is the original molecule which was introduced in terms not only the molecule but the vehicle and all its components that go together. Why do I think that it is important to use innovator drugs? Because generics, at least in India, I'm not confident in using generics or even branded generics. You never know things like the pH, things like its storage, its stability. So these are question marks which can, especially if I'm using it intracamerally, intravitreally, or for my post-op patients, I would rather have the patient spend that 300 or 350 rupees, but sleep peacefully for myself and for the patient. And this is a study that came out which said that 20% of generic ciprofloxacin purchased without prescription, which is very common in India, were underpotent. So this is just for ciprofloxacin. Imagine what it would do for higher antibiotics, and therefore just propagate resistance like crazy. And so take care. And like I said, if you or me were to buy a phone, we would rather wait 6 months or a year, or a laptop, and wait for a good deal on the branded one, rather than just hurrying up and buying something because there is a deal. So same way for your patient's eyes, use antibiotics only when needed. But when you do use them, use the right antibiotic is my philosophy. I do not use antibiotics as a routine in any red eye, unless it is a very classical case of bacterial conjunctivitis. And in my experience, in most urban practices, bacterial conjunctivitis is becoming less and less, and it is mostly viral or allergic conjunctivitis. So please refrain from using antibiotics for any red eye, and particularly now, like I said, in these lockdowns and restricted mobility, it's very tempting to be safe and prescribe Vigamox or Gatiflox or Levoflox, but that is not something which we should be doing. Now, like this is somewhat similar to what Dr. Shreyas was referring to, that there are drugs which can, when you use them in a concentration higher than the minimum inhibitory concentration, they can actually kill more organisms, and therefore the chances of resistance are much low. Similarly, there is a concept in pharmacology called mutant prevention concentration. I would say about, let's say, 8 to 10 times higher than the MIC, or the minimum inhibitory concentration that is needed to inhibit 90% organisms. If you use it at a 10 times higher concentration, you can even prevent mutation and therefore block the chances of antibiotic resistance. So this is the concept of MIC. If you use 4 times higher concentration, you use minimum bacteriocidal concentration. And if it is 8 to 10 times higher, it actually prevents mutations. So yes, use a drug which has a lower MIC and therefore in consequence, a lower mutant prevention concentration. So you can use more of that drug and prevent resistance also. I won't repeat these slides, but basically, when we look at drugs, yes, spectrum we looked at, potency we looked at, dosing frequency, yes, the vehicle, the transport, branded versus generic, and how the judiciousness of use. Another big challenge is pharmacokinetics. That means how effectively is it reaching the tissues, particularly when we talk of corneal, intracameral, and intravitreal penetration. Now coming to the last topic, which is intracameral antibiotics, and Dr. Shreyas beautifully elucidated that, so I don't want to go into the details, but we have been using this, like I said, for over 10 years now, and more practitioners across the world are preferring intracameral antibiotics. In European countries, it is mainly cefuroxime, but in the US and in India, it is moxifloxacin, because it is available to us as a preservative-free, ready-to-use, non-dilution concentration. So I would prefer that over a pharmacy-diluted drug. So I think that is something we are using, and Dr. Haripriya and her colleagues have published the largest study of intracameral antibiotics, and which has come from the Arvind group, thousands of patients, where they have shown that intracameral moxifloxacin is effective and in prevention of not in treatment, but in prevention, and therefore should be considered for phaco and for SICS as a routine practice. So I think, I mean, yes, there can be debates, but if I were to err, I would definitely go for that. And the last point on, it is our duty, it is our role, before any babas or any kind of other people start pushing wrong things in people's minds, it is our duty to educate patients about the role of antibiotics and the role of antibiotic resistance, how big a threat it poses to them and their eyes and their health in the time to come. So I think with that, I would like to end my talk, and we'll be happy to take any questions or comments from any of the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vaishali. So it was a really nice presentation, and I think the role of pharmacist, which you have mentioned, as well as because in terms of just to prevent dispensing the OTC antibiotics, that is that's crucial in the current scenario, because India, it's everything is freely available and there is a no bar with whatever the drug you want to have. So that is the biggest thing which we can do. Which can prevent antibiotic resistance. And another part of I would like to learn more with regards to what you see as a physician. What is the role of physician in terms of preventing the antibiotic resistance? Pharmacist has a significant role. Even patient has a significant role. What is your what do you see as a clinician to what is our role to educate the patients with regards to the antibiotic resistance?
I think the first role that comes as an ophthalmologist is, one, you stop using antibiotics left, right, center. That is number one. And most of us are doing that. But that is step number one. And this is especially important in teaching institutes or where your junior colleagues are learning from you. So just because you have free samples or the government quota provides you free antibiotics does not mean you give an antibiotic to every patient who is nagging you. Unfortunately, it is a harsh reality. Some patients just come to your OPD for getting a drug prescription filled. So first step is we don't do that. Second step, we educate our other non-ophthalmic physician colleagues as and when the chance comes through joint CMEs and newsletters. And then obviously teaching our patients and other paramedical staff. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So I think I would value Dr. Tuhin's comments on this one as well.
So the thing is that actually that many a time what happens, that ophthalmologists, they also feel that corneal ulcer, they treat it, they made this, it is scar, and they felt that it should be tapered now. Earlier it was given too early, then 6 times, then 4 times. There is no question of tapering of the antibiotics first. What is a common practice in most of the ophthalmologists do it. So you tell them that if it is fungal, you should, even after there is inflammation, this corneal scarring has started, you make it maximally 2 weeks for antifungals. For bacterials, antibiotics should be stopped immediately. Otherwise, you will develop antibiotic resistance. And for inflammations and infections, we have to rule out. What is inflammatory, what is infective, that we have to rule out. Most of the ophthalmologists, if they feel that is inflammatory, that is infective, then they can judiciously use antibiotics. There is no point of thinking that if it may be inflammatory, or maybe infective, I can keep on putting the antibiotics. All these things should be discarded. Otherwise, perfectly, your talk was very nice.
So, we have got the feel of second MBBS in your presentation, having a discussion with regards to MIC, MVC, and everything. So, how much is it important for an ophthalmologist to understand with regards to the pharmacology, the pharmacokinetics, and the dynamics of the individual drug to prevent the antibiotic resistance?
So I think, yes, like you said, I also, when I read through all this, it was a large refreshing of my knowledge, but we don't need to really understand the details. What is the MIC and what is this one and that one? What we do need to understand is the concept of what is an MIC. The lower your MIC, that means the less drug, simply speaking, you will need to kill that many number of bacteria or organisms. So any drug which has a lower MIC is obviously better, because you can, second is the dosing frequency of the drug. Third is preservative. For me, that's also a big consideration, especially in post-ops, because already the surface is bad and I don't want to add too much preservative. So preservative free, if I have an option, that is obviously my choice. And yes, you should know the concepts of MIC, MVC, but don't get bogged down by, because every few years there will be a new drug or a new concentration and everybody will claim this and that. What we need to understand is how potent it is for your given set of organisms in your country. And therefore, it is important for us to keep ourselves updated, even in terms of infections. What are the common organisms for our endophthalmitis or keratitis profile in your region? And accordingly, you select your antibiotic. That also is something which is where the role of these meetings and CMEs is large.
Yeah, the concept of antimicrobial stewardship will come into the picture in that aspect to understand the microbiology of your particular area. So the last question, how do you see the role of industry with regards to prevention of the antimicrobial resistance?
Industry, I think, has a huge role in, for number one, educating. When you do your calls or when you teach, yes, it's good to talk about the new products, but it is also good to give a background of what current literature to, even for junior colleagues and for practicing ophthalmologists. Second is public and the patients. I mean, you can do large campaigns which may not involve healthcare practitioners. It can be done at your level, talking about antibiotic resistance, because nobody knows about this. Classical example of all this has been the COVID pandemic that we are going through. One day people are using HCQ, one day people are not, one day azithromycin, one day ivermectin. So just because you have a drug does not mean you use it. Evidence-based medicine needs to be propagated to people, to the lay person. Why is the US or the Europe or the UK not using ivermectin or doxycycline? There must be some rationale. So evidence-based medicine, and that is where industry should help creating evidence and to spread that evidence and the role and the menace of antibiotic resistance to the general public. I think that is the best thing you can do.
So yeah, I can just let me check the questions. Yeah, I think there is no questions with regards to. So thank you, Dr. Tuhin, Dr. Vaishali, with having a lucid presentation and to give the comprehensive idea with regards to the different nuances to post-cataract management as well as the antimicrobial resistance. It was nice having a talk with you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Utkarsh. Thank you, Vaishali.
Thank you, Dr. Tuhin. Bye-bye.
Bye.